Welcome to AZPM's virtual town hall on open primaries. I'm Christopher Conover. We're here tonight to learn about open primaries, an issue that could be on the ballot in Arizona later this year. We'll hear from an expert on the topic and also take your questions. Use the Q&A form on your screen to get your questions to us. Joining us tonight is Paul Johnson with Make Elections Fair AZ. It's a bipartisan group trying to make open primaries the way Arizona handles elections. Paul, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Now, before we get into the issue specifically, let's go ahead and set the table a little bit. Depending on what state you live in, you could vote in a closed primary for party members only, an open primary that lets any registered voter cast a ballot for either party, and then we have things like top two primaries like we see in California. Now, currently in Arizona, if you want to vote in an Arizona primary, you can only vote in the primary for the party you registered with, but Arizona has a large number of independent voters. I checked the registration numbers this morning, and Republicans make up 35% of the voters. No party, what we often call independents, account for just shy of 34%, and Democrats make up 29% of the Arizona electorate. Now, if those no-party voters want to cast a ballot in one of our primaries, they have to request the ballot of a specific party. So, Paul, with all of that said, explain the open primary proposal.
All right. Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you having me on. I think that was a fairly good description of how the existing system works. But start with this. The Arizona legislature today makes a number of determinations relating to our elections. They determine what type of primary we have. They determine what type of general election we have. They determine how voters are going to be treated, independent voters versus Republican voters versus Democratic voters. And they also have the ability to determine how the presidential primary is going to run. Now, what I can tell you has happened inside of Arizona is that we have a legislature that has done its level best to try to discriminate against those independents. Now, independents, as you said, were right below Republicans. But if you went back about 2 months ago, you would have found that independents were ahead of them. What happened? Well, that's easy. If you wanted to vote in a primary, you had to re-register. If you wanted to vote in the presidential primary, you had to re-register in one of the two parties. So independent shrank and Republicans and Democrat grew. But I can tell you, they will shift back. I'm an independent. I changed my party registration to Republican because I wanted to vote in the Republican presidential primary because that was the only place I saw there as being a choice. I am back now to being an independent. You'll see other independents do that as well. Now, the single biggest thing that the Arizona legislature has done is they've created a set of rules that suppress independent and unaffiliated voters and candidates. So I'll give you some examples. Today, if you run as a independent versus a Republican or Democrat for a statewide office, if you run for a statewide office in Arizona, you need about 7,000 signatures as a Democrat, about 7,000 as a Republican. You need over 40,000 as an independent, almost 6 to 7 times more than the Democrat or Republican needs. Why is that? Because they don't want independent candidates on the ballot. It's not hard, right? If you're in one of the existing two parties, you see it as a duopoly. You don't really want competition from the other sides. Now, independent voters are also discriminated against. As an example, that presidential primary that I spoke about a moment ago, independents and unaffiliated voters are taxed for that. The legislature taxes all of us to pay for those primaries. Yeah, independent and unaffiliated voters aren't able to participate. So the very first thing that our measure does is it says in the Constitution that we're taking that right away from the legislature and we're giving it to the people. And you cannot discriminate against any candidate or any voter based upon their registration, whether they're in a party or not registered within a party. All voters and all candidates have to be treated equal. The second thing that we've done is we've created an open primary. The open primary, basically, you're in Tucson. Tucson has a closed primary, but every other city in the state has an open primary system. And that means that all the candidates run, you go in and you vote for whoever it is that you want to vote for in the primary. You're not discriminated against in any way. You're able to participate. What then
And you're talking about for city elections, just to clear up for people at this point.
happens in a city election today, right? Now, we're changing the state elections to being the same. There will be an open primary for all seats other than the presidential election, because we can't have an effect on the presidential election. So we then get to the third item in our ballot, which says that the parties can close out independents. We don't have any right to be able to stop them from doing that inside their presidential primary. But if they do, they can't take public money. They can't take money from the people that they're excluding from the process. Now, our initiative, we have to collect about 400,000 signatures. We're over 400,000 signatures now. We've been in that process for, I don't know, somewhere around 8 or 9 months. We have a number of circulators that are in the Tucson area. We've worked that area very, very hard to make certain that we can collect signatures. And we're going to submit the amount of signatures that we need to be able to make certain that the voters are able to have a choice on this.
And just to clarify for our viewers tonight, if you are an independent, no party voter, you can vote in an Arizona primary. You just have to pick a party and request that ballot. Either do it in advance if you're voting by mail, or you can go on election day to the particular polling place you're supposed to. Where you can't do that is for the presidential primaries, as you said, you must re-register as one of the parties holding a primary. If the Green Party, for example, was holding a primary, you could register with them, but Republican or Democrat is the usual way of finding that.
And to let you know how they're discriminated against, even in the normal primary, the legislature could have said, "Hey, if you voted in the Republican primary last time, we'll leave you on the automatic voter list. Or if you voted in the Democratic primary, we'll put you on the Democratic list. If you want to change, you can submit something." But what they've done to independents, it's different than Republicans and Democrats. Republicans and Democrats automatically get their early ballot sent to them. If you're an independent, you have to take an additional step to be able to cast that vote. And again, what our measure says is you cannot discriminate against voters or candidates in any way, shape, or form. That's not the job of the state to make that determination. And we're doing that by a vote of the public, which means that the legislature won't be able to take those rights away.
Before we get too much further down the road, I've heard people say, and I know at one point your group was talking about, but we're not doing, is ranked choice voting. That's a completely separate issue, and I just want to make sure that everybody understands we're not talking about ranked choice voting here.
Right. So what we've done is we've taken away from the legislature the right to make the decision in the primary and the right to make a decision as to whether or not you can discriminate against independents, and to also make certain that if their taxpayers' dollars are used, that it has to be used and allow them access fairly. What we didn't affect was the general election. The general election we've left for the legislature, which they have control over that today, or for a vote of the public. We did that intentionally. We intentionally didn't cover that portion because it begins to become incredibly complex. And in an initiative, if you don't get it simple, it becomes your ability to lose goes up dramatically. Now, it is possible in the future that people say, "Hey, we'd like to have a ranked choice voter, that we'd like to have a top two." That could be done by a vote of the public, or that could be done by the legislature. But what they cannot affect is what happens in the primary and whether or not you can discriminate against independent voters or candidates.
There are those probably watching tonight, certainly around the state, who don't like this idea, and they say the reason is it lets, for example, Republicans meddle in a Democratic primary, Democrats meddle in a Republican primary, that the parties should have the right to choose who they want to be on the general election ballot. How do you answer that?
So first, you still have the right to make a choice as a party without any interference from the government. However, you can't meddle in the Democratic primary because the state's not going to pay for it anymore. You can't meddle in the Republican primary. It's an open election. Everybody runs. You might have 5 Republicans running in the primary, 3 Democrats, and 1 independent. And then you as a voter get to choose between them in each and every race. So there is no meddling. And again, this isn't unique. We haven't come up with something that is some harebrained idea that hasn't been tried. Every city in Arizona utilizes this process with the exception of Tucson, and it's been working for 60, 70 years well. In fact, if you look at the polling today in Arizona, about 80% of the public is, well, I was going to say they're dissatisfied with Congress, but maybe disgusted might be a better word, but nonetheless, they're very dissatisfied. With the legislature, their popularity numbers are in about the 18 to 20%. Cities, if you're nonpartisan cities, run over 50%. By the way, that's true across the country. 70% of all cities across the country are open primaries, nonpartisan primaries. In almost every state, if you're the legislature and Congress have very low ratings, but the local governments have high ratings if they have an open primary. If they have a closed primary, like New York, the city council has the exact same rating as does the legislature and Congress.
So what about those who say, well, this will kill the parties? There will be no need for the parties anymore, and this is just really an attempt to get rid of the two-party system and just go with independence?
Well, there's a difference between the system and the parties. The parties are going to continue to exist, and they're going to continue to play a role. And by the way, I'm not anti-Democratic Party or Republican Party. I think my own personal opinion is they both bring something to the table of value. They both have some things that I think are important and that we should care about. But so do independent voters, and they shouldn't be cut out of the process. In fact, part of the reason that we've become more divided is because that group of voters, which has dramatically blossomed over the last 20 years, has been eliminated from the process. So you're eliminating the people who are the best motivated to pull us back together. Let me give you some numbers. I think this may help you. So if you look at an election today, about 70% of every voter who could be registered is. Of the voters who are registered, you just gave me the number on the Republican Party, but make it simple. Let's just say it's a third, and a third for each one of the three parties, the independents, the Republicans, and the Democrats. All right, so in a primary, if you took the 70% by the 33%, you end up with about 1 in 5 people that you know, about 21% of the people you know, theoretically could vote inside one of the two primaries. However, the turnout's only 30%. Because they're primary elections, the turnout goes way down. Now times 30% by the 20%, you're talking about 6 to 8% of everyone you know will decide who wins a Republican primary and who wins a Democratic primary. And here's where it gets more hideous. The seats in Arizona, and in fact, across the country number is this: out of 5,000 seats, 70% are decided in the primary. In the legislature, out of 30 districts, only 6 are decided in the general. That means that 6 to 8% of the public is making the decision for who's going to represent that district. And where it gets worse is those candidates who run never have to even address the candidates in the other party or that are independents. So, I was mayor of Phoenix for a while. I hope your viewers will forgive me for that. But nonetheless, I was mayor of Phoenix for a while. And before that, I was on the city council and I ran in a nonpartisan primary. So here's how you do it. And you'll see how this affects thinking. So what you do is when you're running in a city election, nonpartisan, you go and you get a voter registration list. You'll get every Republican, every Democrat, and every independent. Now, I was in a district at the time. I was a Democrat. I'm an independent today. But my district was about 3 to 1 Republican, overwhelmingly Republican. So I knocked on every door. Now, when I knocked on Democratic doors, they told me about their local park or education or different social programs that they were concerned about. When I knocked on Republican doors, a large amount of them talked about their small business, about how traffic was affecting them or regulations was affecting them or how they were affected by taxes. Here's the point. It wasn't all that difficult to begin to recognize that maybe these two things are connected. Maybe the ability to pay for these social programs that we have in our city, police, fire, parks, and recreation, comes from having a strong economy, that these aren't binary choices, that they're choices that can be pulled together. Now, let's say in that same district where I was a city council person, you run for legislature. Oh, it was a very Republican district. I just told you my council district was 3 to 1. There's no chance the Democrat ever wins that seat, ever. They never have, right? So what happens is there's a race on the Republican side. When you're a candidate, you don't go get a list of every single voter. You get a list only of those people who are going to vote in your primary, in that case, the Republican primary. And in fact, you don't even get every voter. You get the high efficacy voters, the ones that you know are going to vote. You're missing 9, 10 out of 11 homes, right? That you're hitting a very, very small amount. Those are the people that are going to vote. And the effect that they're going to have on you is going to be disproportionate to what the majority of the people are thinking. So really this comes down to, do you want your elected representatives to represent the majority, or do you want them to represent a very, very small minority in either party? You know, the ASU has done this study that talks about the Arizona that we want. And what they do in their polling is they go out and they ask the public, what are the issues that matter to them? What are the things that are important to them? And they then only begin to create their list based upon what gets over 70% of the general public and over 60% in people in both parties. They find huge agreement on education and environmental issues and a wide variety of other things. But then they begin to scratch their head and they said, well, why is it that if the majority of the voters agree with this, we can't get our elected representatives to support it? And here's the reason: because they don't represent those people. They represent the small minority that vote in a primary. And then their districts are so stacked, they never even have to talk to the other people. So, you know, two of the people who put up a large amount of funds here, by the way, every dime we've raised so far has come from in-state, every dime. Two of the big givers are people who are extremely involved in education. Why? Because they've begun to recognize that for education to work and to be funded and for us to do the things that we need, you're not going to do it unless we're able to change the way that our voting system works. And the best way to do that is to become more democratic, not less.
I went back before we started on this and looked at midterm primary numbers over the last 4 midterms, 2010, 14, 18, and 22 nationally, and just did a quick scattershot look at it. And turnout was average between 20 and 30% in most states. We've now got 15 states with open primaries. The only one that was an outlier on high numbers was Kansas, had 48% at one point, which is an amazing, especially for a midterm, number. So do we really get that much more turnout, do you think? Or is it still that same 20 to 30% of the registered voters, which is, as you said, is a smaller number than the people who actually live in a given state?
Sure, you do, because I want you to think about it this way. So just make this assumption. Let's say in the primary, the exact same amount of people vote in a partisan primary than in an open primary. Let's say it's the exact same amount. Well, in these stacked districts where there is no general election that matters, that means you're getting double the voters. Because in the primary, you're now getting the Republican and Democratic voters who vote in that primary, who have a say on which candidates are going to represent them, and add independents on top of that, which generally make up about a third. So there's no doubt you increase the turnout. But part of why you're increasing the turnout is because you're giving more people more choices in those races where today they have no choice, where the district is so stacked, it doesn't work. The other thing that I can tell you in terms of turnout or that matters in this is, even more importantly, think about what happens to the candidate. When the candidate, just as I told you that story that I was telling you a moment ago about my race, they begin to listen to other people. And it may be people they disagree with. If you're a Republican, you're going to listen to Democrat. If you're a Democrat, you may have to listen to Republicans. I believe that doesn't make you weaker. It makes you stronger. And it makes you understand that there's more than one side. And it helps create some civility. So I have a podcast called The Optimistic American, and I've had a variety of guests. One of the guests that I had on my show was the Speaker of the House, or excuse me, the Majority Leader in the Senate in Alaska, who was deeply opposed to open primaries. She was one of the leading advocates against it in Alaska. It won. She won re-election. She then won inside the open primary system. She's still the majority leader. And she's now become a big supporter of it. And I said, okay, help me understand. You were against it, and now you're for it. She goes, well, look, I'm a Republican. I was worried as a Republican that this was going to somehow or another advantage Democrats. And she said, the first answer to that was, we still had the same Republicans winning Republican seats and Democrats winning the Democratic seats. I said, okay, well then why do you think that it's better? I don't understand. And her answer was so revealing. She said, in the old legislature, where people were elected in these partisan primaries and never had to face the general voter, these were the top three issues. The first one was the election fake? Did it really happen? Was it stolen? Right? Here, and by the way, on both sides, she said that was the biggest issue. Second biggest issue was what sex uses what bathroom. She said the third biggest issue was abortion. She said today, the three biggest issues under this new legislature is where you have people who've run having to go out and talk to both sides. The three biggest issues are transportation, education, and economic development. She said overwhelmingly it's worked. So much so that she's now invited the Democrats into their caucus so that they can talk about issues beforehand. And she says, and we keep finding all this ground where we have the ability to come up with consensus. Again, why? Because those Democrats now are knocking on Republican doors and they're hearing the other side. And the Republicans are knocking on Democratic doors and they're hearing the other side. Look, we know there's big divisions in this country. We know that's one of our big, big challenges. I don't know how to fix that problem if we don't start listening to one another. The structure today disincentivizes people to listen to one another. It incentivizes candidates to be as extreme as they can, to demonize the other side, and to hate the idea that they would even think of meeting with the other party. This system incentivizes people working together. So in the end, I understand why some people oppose the system. Some people like it the way it is. They're very happy with the way it is. It works fine for them because they're getting what they want. And if you're somebody who hates the other party, my guess is you're going to kind of like the existing system because it's going to keep promoting that. But if you think we can do better, this is a solution that the voters will get to make a choice on.
Let's talk about, since you've brought it up, let's talk about candidates for a second. And I'm going to let Shirley, who's one of our viewers tonight, she sent in a question in the Q&A section, and she wanted to know, would candidates have to get rid of their party designation on the ballot for this proposal?
No, when a candidate runs, it's their choice. They could say I'm an independent, or they could say I'm a Republican, or they could say they're a Democrat, which by the way is the way it works today. You get to choose what you put underneath your party label. We allow them to make that choice. It still goes on the ballot next to them. And then the voters can make a decision based upon that. And my guess is, if you're a Democrat in a highly Democratic district, the D is going to help you. If you're a Republican in a highly Republican district, it's going to help you. But you're still going to have to go talk to people on the other side, and that's going to change you.
Do you think that the candidates themselves change, as in we see a different group of candidates, or it merely forces candidates to act differently?
Both. So I don't want to pick on anyone, but we can see in our Congress, there are people on the far right and far left. And we can see that some of those people actually believe the crazy things that they're saying. That's not lost on me, right? They're not faking it. They really kind of believe in the conspiracy theory of the week that they're promoting, or the fact that the other side is evil. In those cases, they're probably going to lose. They're probably going to lose to somebody in their own party. That's probably what's going to happen. But overwhelmingly, the majority of people who are just regular candidates and go out and knock on doors, they're going to be transformed. They're going to be transformed because I'm telling you, if you have to sit down and listen to people who don't agree with you, by our nature, we start trying to find common ground. I love our founders. I'm just a big believer that these guys were ingenious. But one of my favorite lines was Franklin's, who said, "Ma'am, it's a republic. If you can keep it, But to keep it, you can't have compromise be a bad word. In the end, the politics is a place that we go to work out our grievances and our problems. It's just by nature that that's the place that we go to do that. And in that, if you want to be able to hold the union together, you have to find common ground. I also found as mayor that in finding common ground, in listening to Republicans on my council and Democrats on my council, that usually the legislation was better because I'd get the fiscal approach, I'd get the business side of it, but I'd also get maybe the people side of it or a neighborhood side of it. And when you begin to mix those things, it becomes a richer, better proposal. And I can give you hundreds of examples that fit within that.
A question again from the audience, and this is a long one, so I'm going to read it so I make sure I do it correctly and don't mis-summarize it. It says, our Arizona state rules about initiatives include a rule saying an initiative must pertain to only a single issue or it's not allowed on the ballot. While it's being stated that this initiative is about open primaries, I heard at least 3 different changes this initiative would bring if passed. To me, that sounds like the initiative would be seen as violating the single issue parameter.
So to start with, I can tell you that the one thing you should do if you run an initiative is lawyer the heck out of it, because he's exactly right. The single subject rule has tested these issues. Now, we're fortunate. We got this one on the ballot and had it tested in the past and won. All right, so we know we fit within the designation of what the Supreme Court said was the single subject rule. But it's also why we didn't get into saying you should have a ranked choice vote or talk about what was happening in the general, because the more complex you are, the more you add on top of it, the higher the likelihood that that takes place. We've had some very good lawyers on this, and I can tell you they have spent, well, a lot of money as well as a lot of time making certain that we fit within that rule.
Another question from our audience right now. How might an open primary change the way the legislature works and policy is established?
So the answer I gave you a moment ago, I think is probably the best answer, which is if you take a look at what they prioritize, there's a different list of priorities when you are elected in a primary. When you're elected in a primary by only 6% of the public, I've seen polling of people on both sides. And of the people who vote in the primary, a good 50% of them are dramatically more extreme than the general election voter, dramatically more extreme. If you only have to appeal to that one extreme group, your policy will tend to be more extreme. So as Catherine Gessel said, majority leader in Alaska, don't be surprised when the major issues in that type of a system end up becoming abortion and who uses what bathrooms and whether or not the election was fraudulent. What begins to happen in an open primary system, and you can see this in cities that have adopted it, they begin to focus less on those fringe issues and those issues that everyone wants to see us working on. Everyone wants a better educational system. Not everyone wants to be arguing about who uses what bathrooms, right? Everyone wants a better transportation system. Everybody has some concern about the environment. We may have differences in how we approach it, but I can tell you when your air quality is bad, I can get the hardest core conservative to stand up and talk about why it's important. How do I know that? Because we had an air quality problem in Phoenix, and you can see the polling, both sides were supportive. But it's much more difficult to get those issues to be mainstream issues when you're dealing with people who are elected by the extremes on either side.
So you've mentioned the attorneys you all are working with, and you've mentioned how issues become more centered, if you will. People may not realize this, and I don't think I mentioned it in the beginning. This is a bipartisan effort. As someone who's covered politics in Arizona now for close to 2 decades, I recognize a lot of names involved in your group, and they're known names, and they're from both parties. And doing some research for this, I think it's about 15 or so states now have open primaries. Many of them are in the South, which is traditionally more conservative, but then you have places like Vermont and Hawaii, which are traditionally more liberal, that have open primaries. So this is a bipartisan issue.
Oh, no, this is the, I can tell you it's bipartisan in two ways. The first one is it unites the extremes of the right and the extremes of the left together. So people who've won by having to confront an extremist on the other side, they tend to not like what we're doing. It gives them an advantage. And again, we'll see extremes on both the right and the left that oppose it. But if you look at who's supporting it, there's no doubt. We have an overwhelming amount of independents and unaffiliated voters supporting it. But there's also a lot of Republicans and Democrats. And if you look at who's on the committee, I would say it's almost evenly split with only a few independents.
Another question from the audience. Can the parties still choose candidates for the general election?
Yes, and I don't want to take credit for that because that's the law. So the United States Supreme Court and in ruling on our Constitution say that that we have a right to assemble with whatever groups we want to assemble with. So if you and 10 other Democrats want to create a Democratic organization, you have a right to do that. If you want to create a Democratic Party, well, if you want to be a part of the Democratic Party already formed, you have a right to do that. And so the Democratic Party can still, if they want, make an endorsement. And you'll see sometimes in city elections, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party get involved and they make that decision. But it doesn't change the candidate who has to go out and still speak to people on the other side to be successful. And what you'll find, I can tell you in Phoenix elections, being endorsed by the party oftentimes was more harmful than it was helpful, but it didn't stop them from doing it.
You mentioned that right to assemble, First Amendment, of course. The courts, it's a legal gray area that's argued from time to time that this could violate the First Amendment and that right to assembly. Again, you have attorneys with your group. Is this something you all have talked about as a possible challenge should you make the ballot and should it pass come November?
The good news, what we're doing is that, like I told you before, this isn't a novel idea. It's not a new idea. 70% of the cities across the country have had it. It's been tested at the Supreme Court level. The reality is, if the voters of the state make the decision that this is what they want, it's going to survive easily at the US Supreme Court level. Now, at the state level, we had one of your callers a moment ago say, hey, you're going to have to comply with the single subject. Almost every initiative I've ever been involved with, and I've been involved with 14 of them now, they all end up getting that challenge. And the argument is always made, there's more than one subject here, which is again why it's unfortunate, but the legislature hates the initiative and referendum process. And they've done everything they could to make it more difficult to get them passed because they despise them. And so they've created strict compliance on signatures. Like if you have somebody that's filling it out and they put May 3rd, and then somebody puts in May 2nd, boom, that signature has to be scratched. If the T's aren't crossed, if the I's aren't dotted. They've increased the amount of signature requirements that you have to get to by doing that. And then they also have done things like saying you can't pay somebody per signature. You have to pay them by the hour. None of those were done to protect workers, right? Those were done because they hate them and they want to make them more expensive. Now, the downside to citizens wanting to do an initiative is you have to spend money lawyering these things up front or they're not going to be successful. That means that you're going to have to legitimately pull together a very strong group, because if you don't, what will happen is you can get all the way through the process, get the signatures, get on the ballot, win, and then be struck down. So there's no doubt challenges can exist. That in America, like it or not, you can be sued for anything by anybody at almost any time. That's just the way the rules work. But we've done the right standard of care to make certain that we're in a good position to be able to withstand any of those assaults.
This will be all elections are partisan, but 2024 being a presidential election is going to be possibly more partisan as we go through this system this year. It's going to also be a very long ballot. How do you get this message out all the way through November when early voting starts in October? Amongst all the other noise, we have a presidential election, we have another U.S. Senate election, other ballot questions, including potentially abortion. which will take up a lot of space. How do you get this message out?
So before I answer that question, I'm going to just give a little bit of a precursor to it. You're right, it's going to be a very long ballot, and that was intentional. In fact, I have a number of friends who are in the legislature who don't like what we're doing, who have talked to me, and they've told me, yeah, we're going to make it a long ballot, because the longer the ballot, the more likely it is that people vote no. It becomes confusing, right? So they create this really long ballot, and then you become confused as to what's there, and it frustrates you, so you vote no. That means it's going to be harder for us to get a yes vote. There's no doubt about that. That creates a hurdle for us. I can tell you that when members of the public find that out, they become extremely irritated by it. They don't like it. And that becomes an angle that we can and we will use in promoting our measure. But we are going to have to run a campaign. Campaigns are changing. There are lots of different mediums to put up your messaging on: television, radio, mail, newspapers, social media, social marketing. And if you want to know what the right answer is to that, it's all the above, right? One of the things I learned, like if somebody was listening to this thinking they wanted to run for office, I can tell you the greatest lesson I learned in running for office, which is a voter needs to be hit 10 times before you even have the credibility to listen to your message. Meaning, if I send them a letter today and it's the best letter ever written, they're going to see, who's Paul Johnson, and throw it away. And if they do read it, they'll say, who's Paul Johnson, and still throw it away. But if they saw a 4x8 sign, and then a yard sign, and then there was a neighbor that had a coffee, and they heard there was a coffee down the street, and then they hear something on radio, and then they see something on television, and then they see something on their social media. Now, when they get that letter, you built up a brand, and that brand gives you credibility. And now they'll take a look at it. Oh, I heard about this Paul Johnson, and they'll read it. So that part of campaigning becomes a very, very important component. And we have to do that. We have to make certain that the voters know who we are.
You bring up that you have to touch the voter 10 times, as campaign folks say, as you mentioned. If we do open primaries, do we get more candidates potentially on the ballot? And does that make it more expensive because you might have to touch them more? So do we make it therefore only candidates who are well-funded have a chance on this?
So this is my guess, and it's an educated guess because I've watched this around the country and I've watched how cities work, but it's only an educated guess. You're going to have a lot more candidates in the first 1 or 2 elections, because if it wins, there will be a sense of change in the air. And when change is in the air, it definitely has an effect at driving out people to want to run for office. But at some point that normalizes. It normalizes back down to regular numbers. Then where it creates a change is the first election really matters, the primary election, the open primary. So when you come in to vote, if you're a Democrat in a Republican district, you still have somebody to vote for, because you get to cast your ballot for whoever you want, whether they're a Republican or Democrat. And you may say, you know what, I'm a Democrat, but I'm going to vote for a Republican that I think is a more moderate Republican. That happens. The second ballot ends up being the election that's tied to the presidential election or the governor's election. And that gets a turnout kind of all by itself. But my guess is that you'll have more choices. Up front, we'll have more candidates running. Overall, you'll always have more choices because there'll be more candidates in the primary. But it will normalize. And that's what we've seen in cities and states that have adopted it.
I have another question here. How would an open primary impact diversity among candidates? Too often, it seems like all we have is poor choices, election after election, the lesser of two evils.
So I will give you a couple of answers to that. The first one is, we've never had a presidential election like this one. And here's why. I think the numbers in the 70s of the public who doesn't like either candidate, right? They're not going to vote for who they like. They're going to vote against who they dislike. But that's created an incredible sense of frustration by the voter saying, really? Is this really the best we can do? Because they don't like either one of them. And they're worried about and wonder why we can't do better. Well, I can tell you, it's the system. It's that you're getting the candidates that the parties want you to get. That is exactly what's happening. You're getting the candidates that the extremes inside those primaries think are the best people to represent them. The people who vote in the general election are appalled by it. Now, in terms of what happens in elections, and this is going to go a little bit beyond what we can fix. There is no silver bullet to all of our problems, and this one's not a silver bullet. But I would tell people in the public that the following is true. I had a pollster once. I helped run 3 presidential races, and in one particular race, I was trying to convince my candidate to go appeal to the Broad Center, and I was opposed by other people in the campaign. And the pollster finally met with me and talked to me and said something very interesting. This pollster said, "Look, our job is that we need to solidify our base, and let me tell you how you solidify the base." The pollster said, "If you can give me what party someone's in, what gender they are, and how old they are, I can tell you how to terrify them. And if I terrify them, the amygdala kicks in. And the amygdala is this reptilian portion of the brain that clouds that neocortex so that you can't think rationally. And once we get them locked in on fear, then all we have to do is go convince the people in the general election that our candidate's not as bad as theirs." That is, I just gave you the process that people work to win elections. Now, other groups have joined in. The parties do that. You know, our nightly networks, I think they've recognized, look, if you terrify people, they'll turn the TV on tomorrow. So everything becomes existential. And everything we're hearing is existential. And so people who would generally be more moderate voters and more looking for compromise, they're becoming worried. That begins to become even more polarizing. The system incentivizes that. The open primary disincentivizes that. How do I know? Because I've run in one. I've won in one. I've campaigned all across the country in city elections for different people. I've watched it from a presidential standpoint. The architecture matters. And the system that we have today, it is not in the US Constitution. Political parties aren't even mentioned in the Constitution. In fact, Thomas Jefferson once said, you know, if I had to go to heaven with a party, I'd rather not go at all. Right? The founders didn't like the concepts, but they evolved. For a variety of different reasons, they evolved. Our goal isn't to get rid of them. It's to, one, make certain that those people who are being cut out are put back into the process. And two, to make certain that candidates have to appeal across the aisle. So, you know, think about it this way. Political parties incentivize us to see everything from a binary standpoint. So I'll give you the binary issues. They want you to either see it as you're either pro-labor or you're pro-business. You're either pro-business or you're pro-education. You're either pro-God or you're pro-human rights. Now, if you're not in one of the two parties, or at least in the extreme factions of them, it's not hard to look at those 3 things and say, wait a minute, how can you be pro-labor without being pro-business? How does that work? They're connected, right? And how can you be pro-business without being pro-education? That's your workforce. That's the people who are going to be your buyers. That's improving the lot of everyone so that our products begin to have higher values. And God doesn't support human rights. I'm not buying it. I'm just not buying it. There's more than 2 ways. And right now we're stuck in the idea there are only 2 ways. The answer is that's not true. But our architecture is limiting us.
You mentioned there's more than 2 ways. Does that mean this could allow for more third-party candidates to get in and be successful?
I think it will allow for people who are not registered as Democrats or Republicans to be more successful. Now, I can tell you, if you're in a third party and your third party, probably a third party because it has a more extreme view, if you go appeal to the extreme view of your party, you're probably not going to win. You still have to go appeal to the majority of the voters. And so while third-party candidates can get in, they have to do the same thing the Democrat, the Republican would have to do. I do think that unaffiliated voters and unaffiliated candidates over time, you will definitely see an increase in the amount of people who are not affiliated with parties of any party begin to become successful.
We have another question here. The person says, we want to see some sense of a stable base for society and consistency. A constitutional change, which this would be, is very serious. What about unintended consequences?
So, a couple of things. First, this is not a new idea. It's an idea that's been tried and true. It's worked in every city in the state except for Tucson. So start with that. The second thing that I would tell you is, I already know what the consequences are of this, but I may not be able to convince you that I know all of them. So here's what I would tell people who aren't convinced. Be really worried about the unintended consequences of not doing this. Be really concerned about the divisions that we're having and getting candidates who are subpar candidates and having a system that is designed where people are fighting and where they're not working together. Be very careful about what that means to the Constitution and the United States. Here's what we forget. And this is one of my single biggest pet peeves. This is the greatest superpower in the history of the planet. There's nothing like the United States. And we take a lot of grief internally and externally without recognizing how great a place this is. We've also done more to move human progress forward than any other nation in the history of the planet. Our system, the democratic capitalistic system, works. It's very effective. That doesn't mean that there aren't tweaks that are needed, but our political system, it's not serving up to the greatness of this country. And all you have to do is look at the candidates that are running to recognize that. Be deeply worried about the unintended consequences of allowing subpar people who are not representing us well to continue in a process where they don't have to appeal to the voters.
Question again from one of our viewers tonight. They say the idea of independent candidates voting is a spoiler in a close election. A, does that apply here? And B, is that even statistically true, if you know?
Most spoilers inside the existing system tend to be third-party candidates, not independent. So as an example, if you're a Libertarian Party, you can be a spoiler for the Republican Party. If you are a Green Party candidate, you can be a spoiler for the Democratic Party. And we've seen examples inside the existing system where the other party has gone out and gotten people from the other party, from one of those minority parties, to run, knowing that it would take away 3 or 5% from the other candidate. In fact, they've misused the public funding system that we've created to be able to do that. In terms of independents running, I guess an independent in the existing system could be a spoiler. So if you looked at the governor's race and you said, you know what, we have a Democratic Party and a Republican Party, and we have a right to our candidate having a shot against the other person. I call that entitlement. But if you think that you're entitled, then if you had a third party candidate, yeah, I guess maybe it could destroy your ability to be successful. Now, let me tell you, in our system, no, they don't become a spoiler. They become just another candidate. And number two, our system requires that when you get done with the primary, you must have 50% of the vote plus one, right? That's something that we took from other cities, because when cities did that, required 50% plus one, it kept somebody winning with only 20% or 30%, right? You had to get to that 50% mark. So the point that I'm giving to you is that it's much more likely that a spoiler will work in the existing system than it will in ours.
Again, another question from our viewers talking about turnout. If the overall numbers don't change so much, as we were talking about earlier, but a little bit of the who is voting does, what do we need to do to just increase voter participation?
Well, I'm a big supporter of things that increase voter participation, but they're controversial today. There's no doubt early ballots mail-in ballots have a huge effect in increasing turnout. So there's one of the things that you could do if you want to increase turnout. Allowing everybody to be on the early voting list automatically, you would increase turnout. So today, if you voted in the primary 2 years ago, and when the primary comes up this time, you're automatically going to get a ballot, unless you're an independent. Then you have to decide which party you want to run in, or excuse me, vote in, and then you have to send in a form to make certain that you can do that. If you automatically sent them a ballot, you would increase turnout of independents and unaffiliated voters. So there's no doubt in my mind this will have an effect at increasing turnout. I also believe that this will assist us in making certain that, again, candidates have to appeal to all voters. But to really make big improvements to turnout, things like mail-in votes are substantial in terms of their ability to increase turnout.
Question here, and this requires you to put on your, as you mentioned it, you're a fan of the founding fathers of the nation, so this requires you to put on your historian's cap maybe, and we'll see how you do. If open primaries are so good, why did we ever establish party primaries in the first place?
So for those of us who will remember our history, we had a fight going on between Jefferson and Hamilton, and both of them had differing points of views, and the parties began to form around them. Now, it wasn't the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It was, I think, the Democratic Republican Party at the time and the Federalists, which later became the Whigs, which later evolved as well into the Republican Party, and the Democratic Republican became the Democratic Party. But we began to make some big changes during the Civil War. And during the Civil War, one of the sets of changes that we made was that the Republicans were the only ones left in power because most of the Democrats who were Southerners had walked out of the Senate. So they created rules that began to give more power to the party that was in power. And they began to strip away the minorities party's rights. And that worked for them for a while, because I think there was only one president that was elected that was a Democrat for about 50 years after Abraham Lincoln. That began to change again just a couple of years ago. We've watched this Ukraine vote, which, by the way, I think, my hat's off to Speaker Johnson. I think he did a good job on that. I certainly, I know I don't agree with him on everything, but that was an important vote for this country, if you ask me. But what's really interesting about that is that it's so obvious. The overwhelming majority of Republicans supported that measure, but it was being held up. Why? Well, because they changed their process. Here's what the process is now. You have to be able to win without getting a single vote from the other side. Meaning what's beginning to evolve is that we're not becoming more democratic. We're becoming even more partisan, even more exclusive. And the Republicans that I know that were in the Senate and in the House, were extremely frustrated by that whole concept and what's taking place, and that they can't quite figure their way out. Well, I can tell you, if you get a handful of states that elect an open primary, you will probably see a caucus of people who begin to say, hey, I'm going to work with both caucuses. I'm going to work with both sides. And they become a group of people that help pull us together. But today, inside the partisan system, it's driving us the wrong way. So the existing partisan system, it evolved and then got worse, and then it evolved some more and got worse again. And today it's to the point where really the number one job of the political parties is to terrify you, to make certain that you become part of their base voter. And then when they get done, they know their candidates, that the public doesn't like them. And so all they have to do is convince you the other side's worse. I'm looking for something more aspirational. I'm looking for people who are willing to give us a vision of where we should be going, as opposed to constantly telling me why the other side is worse.
As we wrap this up, we're basically at the end of our time here. I think we can answer a couple of questions that have come through very easily, but I'm going to let you give it. What's the web address for your group?
You can find us at Fair Arizona. Just Google that and it'll come up. And hopefully we'll give you a copy of that. You can send it out to your voters, or excuse me, to your watchers.
All right. Well,
Viewers.
thanks so much for spending time. Well, watchers, viewers, it's online. I'm not even, yeah, we're not sure what they are officially called. The folks who participated tonight and sent in a bunch of questions, which we certainly appreciate. And we appreciate you spending some time with us.
Yeah, they can also at Paul at optimistic or optamerican.com. If they have questions they'd like me to answer, feel free to have them do so.
All right, great. Well, thanks again, Paul, for coming in. Next week, for those of you who are watching, and Paul, you certainly can join in too as a viewer, we'll have a town hall looking at the history and current legal situation surrounding abortion in Arizona. And then in 2 weeks, we'll have a town hall about increases in the minimum wage. Now, you can keep up with all of our election coverage this year on the Your Vote section of our website, news.azpm.org. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for joining us.